Hello and welcome to the Freakish Lemon video podcast. I am your host, the Freakish Lemon. I go by Adrian. I use masculine pronouns. And welcome to any new viewers. Thank you so much for clicking on whatever you clicked on to get here. And welcome back any returning viewers. Thank you so much for following along with all this nonsense that I'm doing. This is a crafty type podcast coming to you from the Northwest Hills of Connecticut. And show notes for this episode and all episodes can be found at my website at freakishlemon.com. One of these days I'll remember the whole intro. We have a group on Ravelry. Just search Freakish Lemon in the groups tab and you will find it. And you can follow me as Freakish Lemon at all the fun places like Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Ravelry. And all the links to those things will be in the down bar here on YouTube or somewhere around here if you're watching this somewhere else. And if you are here on YouTube and you want to follow along with what I'm doing, consider hitting that little subscribe button so you can be updated as to when I post new episodes. I'm filming this on Sunday, February 11th, 2018. And yes, I meant to say something there, but I don't recall what it was going to be. So we're going to open this podcast up with a little bit of podcast stuff. Just a reminder that the 2018 blanket make-along is going strong. There's a thread in the Ravelry group. Just come share any progress you're making on blankets that you're making. I really got to post some photos in there so you guys can see stuff that I'm making. I mean, in addition to the podcast, but it would be nice if I could, actually participate in my own make-along. Officially via the thread. And also coming up, we're going to start our half square triangle quilt along. That's going to start March 1st. And I promise within the next week or two I will put up a thread with all the details. But for right now, all the details will be in the show notes. So check that out at freakishlemon.com for the idea of the quilt along. Then we'll do a little bit of life stuff. Not terribly much has gone on in the past couple weeks. Work has been crazy. I feel like every time I talk about work it's been crazy. But we had a really crackin' week this week where our offices, I don't know whether it was the router or the actual internet connection or our security settings or what it was, but basically system crashes, system malfunctions, not being able to connect to the internet and then only being partially able to connect to the internet, things timing out for no reason. And then we had 2 days where the phones were down. So it's been interesting. And on top of that, the weather has been interesting this week. We've gotten a lot of ice. We had one storm that rolled in that started as snow and then ended as ice, which is, while not ideal, better than just straight ice, because if you leave the snow in place, you can crunch down, but then it kept being warm during the day and freezing overnight, so everything compacted into big sheets of ice, and then we got more like sleet and freezing rain. This weekend, yesterday and today, has been fairly warm for February, so there has been a lot of melting going on, which is nice. Hopefully the driveway will be clear by the end of today. Not so concerned about the yard, because there's going to be thick chunks of ice out in the yard, basically until the end of spring, just because of the runoff from the hill that we're on. And, yeah, if the ice is thin enough, you can step through it on grass, but the driveways are nightmare. And that's really all that's been going on. I really haven't done anything else, except for the crafty type stuff I'm about to talk to you about. So let's start with finished objects. I have a finished object this week. It's not something you've seen before because I cranked them out in a night, and these are what I'm calling my laundry socks. These are tube socks that I made on my AliExpress professional circular knitting machine out of my woolen spun bulky mystery fleece. And the reason I cranked these out is my craft room slash the laundry room. It's 2 rooms, but it's a single structure, and once upon a time, long before my parents bought this house, it was a garage. So it tends to be a bit of a heat sink. The heat might be going in there, but as soon as the vents stop blowing, you instantly feel cold. It's just how it goes. Especially at night when you're not getting any residual sunlight at all. And I specifically call them my laundry socks because the back half that's walled off, it was a bedroom and then an office, and then now it's primarily the laundry room because the washer and dryer are back there. It doesn't have any heating vents at all. So that room becomes a freezer in the wintertime. So when I go to do laundry, I either have to put shoes on or double up on socks. So I cranked out these tubes, just using the simple cast on that the book recommended, the little how-to booklet. Cranked a tube, I think it was about 70 rows, and then just drew in the last loops, and then did a loose waving in the end. I wasn't really careful about it because these are literally just to keep my feet warm in the winter when I have to go do laundry, or if I want to stay late down in the craft room and it's really cold outside. So you can see I've been wearing them because I've got heel bumps from where I've been wearing them. My first try at these, I did try to do a short row heel, but there's no way to disengage the needles on the AliExpress Pro Circular, so when you're doing the short row, or at least when I was doing the short row, I kept dropping stitches off just outside of my short row area because of the way the needles go up and down every time you crank the machine. So that's something I gotta work on that machine, but tube socks is good enough to keep my feet warm doing laundry. And usually I just stick them on the ends of my chair that's at my knitting machine. So then I just put them on when I'm down there and I take them off when I go to bed. But that's all I have for finished objects, which moves us in record time over to works in progress. And I have a lot of these, so this is probably where I will ramble the most. So the first thing I want to talk about is my color block weaving project. I finished the last strip of that weaving project. This warp, which is all the fringy bits, is a hand-dyed yarn that I dyed myself. It was originally a very light green that I made with Gabby from Once Upon a Corgi before she was an official yarn dyer back in our great dye experiment of August 2015, I believe, when she first started playing around with dye. And then I never ended up using that green color for anything. It just didn't appeal to me after it had dried and everything. So when my mom started yarn dyeing, and she's Little Elephant Yarn on Etsy, I gotta remember to put some links in the show notes for that. When she was first experimenting with dyeing, I re-dyed that skein over with yellow and a darker green. I got this very lovely green color. And then the weft of this piece is Once Upon a Corgi, Murderer Attempts to Murder Murderer, which is a Series of Unfortunate Events Club colorway. And this is the last color block. So what I need to do now with this project is find the midpoint on all these strips and then sew them together. after the first couple of strips, I started leaving in the waste yarn because they're not all the same length, so I will even them out, and then the plan is that I'm going to, and I need to look up how to do this because I've never actually done this before, hem stitch the edges, and then I have a fringe twister that I bought fairly recently, and I'm going to twist the ends once it's all sewn together. So I probably will not show this project to you guys again until it is finished, because it will be in various states of assembly. So this is probably it for a while, but there will definitely be more weaving, which I didn't include in my show notes here. So note to self, update the show notes. I'm going to talk a little bit about it right now. So the next thing on my loom is the Once Upon a Corgi sample scarf that I'm weaving for my sister Gabby from Once Upon a Corgi, handmade. So what I've done, and there will be video footage here that I'm talking over, but I don't know how long my video clip is. So I warped the loom with black and white. So I found the midpoint. I did a big chunk of white on the right side and a big chunk of black on the left side. And then towards the ends, I did little stripes of black and white as you come to the edges of the woven piece. And what that does is, if you're going from right to left, it shows you what the yarn will look like on a striped warp with the dark color being the majority, a dark color, a light color, and a striped warp with the light color being the majority. So you can see exactly how the color will play with the Once Upon a Corgi yarns. And this is a sample scarf that I'm making out of scraps from my Once Upon a Corgi yarns and scraps of the yarns that Gabby has used for her own projects and store samples. I'm actually not ending up using very much of it. I'm doing about 8 inches of color, and it really doesn't take very much yarn at all. I have these tiny little boat shuttles, which are supposed to be for like the end of a weaving project when your shed is very narrow, but I have a very small loom, so regular boat shuttles kind of are too big for my little 10-inch loom. So it only takes about 2 of those to do 8 inches of weaving on a, I think it's a 12 dent heddle for the fingering weight yarns, at the width that I warped my loom. The warp yarns are both leftover yarns. The black is some Cloudborne fingering that I got from Craftsy a while back, and the white is leftovers from a No Maker skein, the Milk and Cookies skein set, where you get a 100 gram skein of the chocolate chip cookie yarn, and then you get a I don't know, it's a smaller skein, but it's not like a mini skein. It's a 30, might even be a 50 gram skein. I'm not entirely sure how much yarn it was, but I have plenty of it left over, and that's what I used for the white in the warp. And so far I've done a few of the color blocks. If you follow my Instagram, I'm posting a photo every time I get about halfway through a new color block. And this is really fun to see how Gabby's yarn actually weaves up, which has been really fun with the color weave project, but she wanted a sample of her yarns and how they look woven up for her shop. I don't know if it'll end up on the online store at all, but she definitely wants to have it in her booth when she has booth sales, because it's always good to see how yarn can be used in different ways. So that's fun. And note to self to put those notes in the show notes. But if you ever have any questions about that project, shoot me a message somewhere. I can definitely answer any questions you have about what I'm doing with that project and how it's going. And then the next thing I made big progress on is my hand-spun striped sweater, which I'm knitting on my Silver Reed LK150. This is the Tramontane pattern by Amy Herzog, using the Custom Fit website with the swatch I knit on the machine. And the black is Classic Elite Yarns Mohawk wool, and the reds, oranges, browns are my hand-spun yarn from fiber I bought from Spinner's Hill, and I finished the front of the sweater. So I had finished the back previously. I had been working on the ribbing at the bottom of the sweater for 10,000 years because ribbing takes me forever. And then I finished this piece in about 3 or 4 hours. And I only zipped it off twice. I'm improving with my color changes. And I showed a picture of this on Instagram, but this yarn is apparently magical because you can see here there's more yellows and oranges down at the bottom and more reds and browns at the top. And that's exactly how my back piece turned out as well. And the back piece was using one small skein and a half to 75% of another small skein, and this was using one large skein. So I don't know how I managed to, I couldn't have done that if I tried, basically. If I had tried to get them to sort of match, it wouldn't have worked. So this is pretty fantastic, that it sort of matches. So that's very exciting. It's starting to actually start to look like sweater pieces. So I just have the 2 sleeves left to go, and then partial seaming and the neckband. That's exciting. Man, I should really group these by types of project. Kind of jumping all over the place here. Another project I did some work on is my free motion quilting practice. I'm using a grid concept from Quilting the Grid, structured free motion with Christina Carnelli on Craftsy. I still can't tell. The font is slightly different on my Kindle than it is on my laptop, so I don't know why that is, but the R, like if an R and an N are next to each other, it looks very similar to an M, so I'm not entirely sure the last name, but you'll be able to find it on Craftsy fairly easily. So I don't know if I showed you any of these before, but I had a diamond grid that I played around with this kind of loop free motion quilting, and some of these are pretty good. Some of them are not, but like that one's pretty good. But this one definitely gave me a good feel for how to actually smoothly move the piece around. And then I did this one with some more arcs, which are looking much better. I did some big arcs, which are looking pretty good. I just started fooling around with some of these things. And then I started a square with feathers and ferns. So here are what are supposed to be feathers. They're not very good. Here are some what are supposed to be feathers. And then I kind of started doing ferns. And then some of these ferns look okay. I can't tell on the camera backwards. Like this fern looks okay. This fern's not the worst. But I didn't finish practicing with this. because I ended up, as you saw in the last podcast, finishing cutting out all the pieces to my winter wall quilt. So my winter wall quilt is going to be the main quilt for this bed during the summer, especially because I can't have the wool blankets on the bed during the summer. So this is from The Weekend Quilter, which is a Reader's Digest book. It's edited by Rosemary Wilkinson, and this is the winter wall quilt. This is a twin size quilt, but I did some math and cut a bunch of squares to make it a larger size for my full-size bed. So that's the pattern I'm going for. And this bucket is all the strips of pieces that I pieced together. They're all numbered, so I know which row they're supposed to be. And they desperately need to be ironed to flatten out the seams. But I just did a lot of sewing rectangles into long strips this week, which was actually really fun. It was really straightforward and easy. I could turn my brain off after work if I had the energy to work on anything. Just straight through a bunch of straight seams, no problem. But of course those do need to be ironed now, and then I gotta sew the rows together. Once I sew the rows together and iron that out, then I'm going to take some measurements, compare it to my bed, determine whether or not I want or need borders on it, and then sort that out. So that's coming along. And then once I know what the finished measurements of the quilt top will be, I can buy batting if the batting that I have is not enough, and also buy the backing fabric, which I think I'm just going to use a king size sheet for if the dimensions work out. Just because it is going to be a very big quilt, and buying that much backing fabric will be very expensive, even with Joann's coupons. I don't mind buying backing fabric for the smaller quilts, like the twin size quilts or the wall hanging type quilts, but something that big will get very costly. And I got other things I want to spend my paycheck on. So the only other quilting things I have done is I did go through my scrap bin. I have one of those white rectangular IKEA trash bins with the lid that flips up and down that I use for scrap fabrics. As I'm cutting things, I'll just dump a bunch of scraps in there, and then when it's full, dump out all the scraps and cut them into squares and strips to use in quilts later. So I did some of that. And I may have enough 5-inch squares that I don't need to buy charm packs in white and off-white colors for the quilts I'm making for my friends. So that would be exciting, but I'm not sure. I have to go through it. But that's the only other quilting that I have done to talk about this episode. I have been doing some spinning, which is good. I have been working on my Cormo sweater spin, but I just came off of finishing all of that white mystery fleece and going to another big spinning project of just one color was like doing my head in. So I put that back away for a little bit, so I didn't finish the bobbin, so I can't show you the brown singles on a bobbin, but I did grab some of my Classy Squid Fiber Company bats. So this is these are singles from the Classic Squid Fiber Company bat, All the Mirrors of the World, which is BFL, Mohair, Muga Silk, Tussin Oil, Firestar, Carbonized Bamboo, and Angelina. And this stuff is so soft. I spun this on my hitchhiker wheel using a long draw technique. It was so soft and smooth that it just spun itself out of my hands. So that was really awesome. And these are gonna go into the pile of things for my ply party. Because once I have some time and finish the bobbin on my Ashford Kiwi, it will be Ply City, and I'll finish a bunch of yarn all at once. And then I also started spinning from Classic Squid Fiber Company the Intergalactic kit, which had 2 pieces. I finished the first piece, which looks like this, and these are the heavenly bodies. So it was just like little nests of different types of fiber, including organic Polworth, BFL silk blend, mulberry silk, Wensleydale, and faux cashmere, which is a nylon fiber. So I spun up those individually, many of them with the long draw method, but some of them were just short forward draw, and the silk was basically just draft the whole thing out and then spin it. So what's on my wheel now is this, which is the night portion. This was a full 2-ounce bat, I think, or a 3-ounce bat. I'm not entirely sure. But this is a blend of Targhee, Alpaca, Silk Noil, and Angelina. I can't long draw this because the fibers are too short, so I am doing short forward draw on this, which will go a little bit slower because my hands get more tired with short forward draw. With long draw, I just have to worry about my shoulder and how sweaty my hands are. Because unfortunately, holding the fiber towards the end, if it's a really warm fiber, like the BFL was, my hand starts to get all kind of sweaty and gross, and then the yarn wants to stick to itself, or the fiber wants to stick to itself. So that's delightful. But that's really fun to be working on something colorful. Because I've been really just spinning plain white or plain brown, with the occasional break of some drop spindling of white or brown or red. So getting some real color has been really fun for spinning. And then I'm not sure really how to categorize this project, but I finally figured out what I'm going to do with that double weaving experiment. If you're a new viewer, or if you don't recall my double weaving experiment, I had warped my loom in such a way with 2 heddles and 2 pickup sticks so that I was basically weaving kind of a taco shape. So you'd weave the top and then the bottom and then back up and back up. And I was not very good at it. And it didn't look very good. But I figured out what I'm going to do with it. I have these round pillow forms that I rescued from a project from ages ago. I have 2 of them. And this is about the width of a piece I'd need to sew. So if I've got like a 1/2 inch seam allowance, it's kind of the perfect width to do a 1/2 inch seam allowance. So, decided I'm going to make pillow covers. I'll probably weave the fronts of the pillow covers and then just do fabric for the back. So what I did was, I first ran this piece of weaving with a very short zigzag stitch through my sewing machine, just to stabilize everything, because the edges where I had knotted were coming undone and I just wasn't going to risk it. So I just fed it through with a zigzag, because all this is going to get sewn into a seam anyway. So I went all the way around. I did do the selvage edges, which were not raw edges, but they were kind of loosey-goosey because I wasn't very good at this at all. I am keeping some of these little blip mistakes, and that's fine. And then I added this lightweight fabric interfacing, which is the Shawl Shape Flex interfacing, style SF101. And this does say for light to medium woven and knit fabrics. They probably mean actual, like, fabrics that you would buy at a store, but I figure this is strong and soft enough to use for pillows. It's not super stiff. Nope, I'll just drop everything. It's not super stiff the way some of the firm interfacings are, where you have almost a papery back under the glue. This is more like kind of a muslin feeling back under the glue. So it feels as if I just zigzagged this to a lightweight cotton, which is fine. So what I'm going to do, once I'm done with Gabby's sample scarf and another scarf I've planned for myself, I'm going to take the scraps, because you always end up with these sort of mid-length, like maybe this long, or at least I always end up, because I always overwarp my loom. It's always way too long. This long or longer. I do have some leftover warp threads from this that are very long. So I'm basically going to collect all those, warp the loom for about this wide, like an 8-inch width, and weave a piece this long, and then weave another 2 pieces this long to do for the front of the other pillow form. And I will sew this piece and the other pieces that's long together, and then figure out my pillow form pattern. So that's what I'm going to do with that. So that's kind of a multi-craftual project, so I wasn't sure how to categorize it, and none of this is in order anyway. And then I have, because I finished a big piece on the knitting machine, I did a bunch of knit swatches. The biggest downside to knitting on a knitting machine is you can only do one thing at a time, unless you're willing to zip something off with waste yarn and then come back to it, which I'm still fairly new at machine knitting. I do not want to be doing that, especially on a sweater project. So once I was done with the front piece, I started doing a bunch of swatches for ideas. So one of the things I wanted to know, at one point I had done a swatch with fingering weight yarn in a bunch of the different gauges, I think 1 through 5 on the dial, but I didn't do one for the smallest size, which is labeled R. So it's R, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, blah, 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 blah. And so I did a fingering weight swatch with R, which is actually, we compared this, me and Gabby compared this to a sock blank. Oh, it's getting blown out because it's too close to the camera. And it's about the same gauge as a sock blank. So if you've ever knit with a sock blank before, that's about the gauge that this swatch is. Which is exciting. That means that this is a pretty good gauge for hats or for mittens, especially if I do mittens with linings. And I'm going to, at some point, do a swatch with my Green Mountain Spinnery yarn to see what that looks like washed up in probably this gauge and the gauge on a dial 1, because if it looks good in either this gauge or the gauge on dial 1, I might do my Green Mountain Spinnery sweater on the machine, which would be fantastic. Just because I'm really liking the results I'm getting from the machine knit sweater pieces. So if I can do my Green Mountain Spinnery without holding it double or holding it with something, that would be super awesome. I probably won't do too many fingering weight projects at this gauge on the machine. The knitting machine, flatbed machines, tend to work best in the mid-range of their gauge. So like a 3 to a 7 on my machine is really where it's going to perform the best. But that sweater's quantity is the only fingering weight sweater's quantity that I have that I don't want to pair with something else to make it a larger gauge. Like my faded sweater project that I'm thinking about doing is 8 or 9, maybe even more than that, skeins of fingering weight yarn that I can hold double easily. Because I've got a whole bunch of them that fade into each other really well. If I only had 5 skeins of fingering weight yarn to do a faded sweater in, then that would be different, but I don't have any other fingering weight quantities for sweaters. So that's really encouraging. I also did a stripe swatch. I've been doing a bunch of stripe swatches when I can for my Slytherin scarf project that's coming up. And this attempt was doing the every other needle cast on, like I did in a previous swatch that I really liked, but that swatch curled a lot. So I did an I-cord edge on this one, but as you can see, the gauge of my I-cord edge and my bulk of the knitting, the row gauge is different. It's almost a ½ inch taller in the center than on the edges, so that's not going to work. I did see some Harry Potter scarves on machine knitting blog posts when I was just poking around machine knitting blogs and resources, and the pattern that I want to do is the scarf pattern from movies 3 onwards. But I had seen somebody do the scarf pattern from movies 1 and 2. And what they had done was knit it double width flat and then seamed up the side, which I think is what I'm going to end up doing. My original Slytherin scarf is one that I knit in the round and then seamed flat, and I didn't really block it because I didn't know what that was at the time, and it's mostly acrylic yarn. So I think I'll still use the ribbed pattern scarf pattern that I have for an approximate cast on count and for the stripe sequence, but I think I'm just going to knit it flat and seam it up. I think that's going to give me the best results for what I'm looking for with this scarf, and that'll take me very little time on the knitting machine because the knitting machine does stockinette stitch like a pro. And then I also wanted to try a new idea for my Shawl Shapes design project. I was looking at my Shawl Shapes with the short rows, and I decided to try something different. Instead of the directional short rows, I tried doing basically short row wedges with short rows on either side. So this side is made of short rows and that side is made of short rows. This swatch is a little bit janky because here in particular, I must have flipped one of the levers to knit the stitches in hold position, which kind of wiped out my short rows. a couple of times, so this is not the best example, but it did give me a general shape, which I'm finding more pleasing. So I went back with 2-color yarns. These are the Cormo yarns that I knit a hat and mittens out of. And I did each short row wedge in 1 color. So this is 5 wedges, easy to see, and I think this is the kind of idea that will end up in my semicircular pattern, with also directions on how to do, I mean, it'll include directions on how to do this, but then you can add as many wedges as you want. If you want a semicircle, you do 5 wedges. If you want to do more shaped so that it'll just come over your shoulders, you could just add a couple more wedges. You can do 10 wedges and do a circle. So that'll be really cool. And the only blip on this swatch is this little blip where there are 2 stitches. There are only 2 stitches here from the cast on. Well, the cast on is this whole thing, but you don't end up knitting these 2 stitches, except one at the very beginning and one at the very end. So there's a little blip there, but I don't think that will be noticeable at all at the gauge that I will be doing the actual shawl in, or once it's, you know, this long. So that looks really good to me, and that makes me very happy. I just have to write down what I did, and that's starting notes for that shawl once I get that on the machine. So that's the end of my whips. Lots of whips. I didn't end up working on any cross stitch this week, or any hand knitting stuff. So let's move on to a little bit of new stuff. I did get some new toys for my knitting machine. So first thing I got is a set of garter bars for my machine. I'm not going to take out that second one. So I've got 2 of these, and 2 of these will span the length of my machine basically, and I can attach them to each other with a piece. But this is a garter bar, looks like a comb, and basically, because the knitting machine does stockinette, if you want to do garter stitch, you either have to reform the stitches on every other row, or if your whole piece is garter stitch, what you can do is take one of these, put it onto your latch hooks, slide your piece of knitting onto this, pull it up, turn it around, and then put your knitting back onto the machine, knit a row. And keep doing that every row, just picking up your knitting and turning it around. It's time consuming, but it is so much easier to do it with a garter bar than it is to reform the stitches every other row. If you're doing small pieces of garter, like if I do my Green Mountain Spinnery sweater on the machine, what I'll probably end up doing, because I want to do something similar to the Flax Light pattern by Tin Can Knits, and that has garter down the sleeves, I think. So what I would do for that is to reform the stitches just for that small amount of knitting. But if I wanted to do a sweater in garter, I have this to pick things up and turn it around and put it back on the machine. So I also did some swatches with the garter bar. So I started with a little bit of stockinette stitch down here at the bottom, and then did some rows in garter, and then did some more rows in stockinette, but I left it facing the other way so I could see how the stockinette looks with reverse stockinette, or how the garter looks with reverse stockinette and with stockinette. And let me tell you, on the machine, because it's weighted, when you're making the garter, it looks like this. And then I washed the swatch and I was like, oh, I only did that much garter. That's not a lot of garter at all. But I'm very pleased with how this looks. And I might, in the future, do some sweaters with garter bands instead of ribbed bands. Because I think that looks really, really nice. I think that would look really great at the bottom of a sweater. But that's fun. So, new toy with this. Also, this was super handy during some other swatches because I had to take all the knitting off the machine in order to reset it because I was screwing something up, which I'll tell you about in a second. Because the other thing I bought was an AG11 Intarsia carriage, which looks like this. It's a very simple carriage. It has the handle to move it back and forth, the little thing to trip the row counter, little clippy to make sure it's attached to your machine, and the gauge dial, which you would match to whatever you were knitting your stockinette gauge on. And then this is what it looks like underneath. It's a lot simpler than the normal carriage. The normal carriage has a bunch of different places your needles can go. It's got 2 of those little brush thingies. It's got levers and things. This is very, very simple. It does one thing. Well, technically it does 2 things. If your needle's in working position, it'll move it to, I don't remember what that position is called, but it's the C position on the silver reed machine, the LK150. It's kind of an in-between position that I haven't really used very much, and it'll also do Intarsia. So the first thing I did was just play around with the Intarsia. I did this bottom portion with my regular carriage that comes with the LK150, and then this is the Intarsia, which looks really good once it's blocked. But I can show you there's some goofs back here. There's this fun loop. I left this loop in there. I could have corrected it, but that is the point at which I took this whole thing off of the machine and reset everything and then put everything back on because I was fighting with this Intarsia carriage for the first half of this square. So what you do when you are knitting with a regular carriage, you feed the yarn up through the yarn tensioner thing. You can go look up a video of what it looks like on anywhere, but it tensions the yarn for you and you just knit back and forth. For the Intarsia carriage, because you're doing color work, you don't have your yarn feeding up, you put the yarn below the needles. And you drape the yarn for each color that you're knitting, and then, you know, twisting them, over the needles, and then run this carriage across. So tensioning the yarn is done by you and this carriage, instead of an automatic process. So I had trouble getting used to that, but I was also running into problems where things were slightly out of position, and they just wouldn't knit all the stitches. I don't know exactly what happened, but once I reset it, it was pretty easy. It was probably just that first time getting everything set up. I didn't know what I was doing. So once I reset it and had some practice on it, this whole part went much faster. And then the stockinette I did up here, I actually did with the Intarsia carriage, just taking the strand of yarn, laying it across the entire thing, and going over it. You have to go slower with the Intarsia carriage than with a regular carriage. At least that's been my experience so far, because of how it's knitting the yarn and how you have to tension it with your other hand. It's something to work on. So I used it for a piece of Intarsia and just some straight stockinette knitting. And then earlier today, I wanted to see how it would work for stranded color work. Because I've heard of people using the Intarsia carriage for stranded color work. I have used my regular carriage for Intarsia, or not Intarsia, for stranded color work. And it worked pretty well, but it was 2 passes of the machine for each row. And that was 2 color work. If I had any more colors, it would need another pass of the machine, which I can understand if you have problems keeping track of your row count, because that will trip the row counter every time you pass the machine. I was knitting a hat, so it was just the 1 chart, and then you do your decreases in 1 color, so that wasn't a problem for me. But I wanted to see what it would be like on the Intarsia carriage. So I did a few rows in stockinette with my regular normal carriage for the LK150, and then I did some basic 2 color work. Over here is where I ran into some problems, and it ended up zipping a bunch of these off the machine, and I just put whatever stitches I could grab from that column up onto the machine and kept going. I wasn't going to fix it. It's a swatch. This bit of color work went a little easier, but it's tricky to lay the yarn over in short repeats like that, unless you have a bobbin for each thing. I just had the 2 strands of yarn, and I just twisted them over each other. This is what the back looks like, which did put some drag on the yarns as the carriage was knitting them, because they were twisted over each other, and it couldn't pull enough yarn to do the stitches very easily. And then I reset it. And then up here, I just did some long color repeats, and I could see where if you were doing like little blips on a sweater, you might want to do the Intarsia carriage on those rows, because it's really easy to catch your floats if you're already twisting the yarn that way. I haven't caught my floats using the regular carriage because I was making a hat and I didn't really care. So I could see that, but I think I'd have to do more color work on my regular carriage to see if there's any advantage to using the Intarsia carriage for stranded work as opposed to the regular carriage. But playing around with those. Gotta play around when you get new toys. And that's it for new stuff. Which is going to bring us to a smidge of other stuff. I haven't really been doing much other stuff this week. Stuff I'm watching. I started the other day watching the Round Rabbit podcast by Nancy. Mostly because I was looking for podcasts with machine knitters, and it's my understanding that she recently bought a knitting machine. But she doesn't needle knit at all. She's a loom knitter, which I thought was really, really interesting, and is something that I'm learning much more about through her podcast. I started from the beginning, and I'm just having them play while I'm doing stuff. So I'm on episode 16, I think. So about halfway through her podcasts, and I'm really enjoying them. She's sometimes hilariously blunt, which is super fun, and it's really nice to be watching a podcast. This sounds terrible. Podcast of somebody who is not a prolific knitter. I feel like I watch a lot of podcasts with people who knit very quickly. And I was somebody who was knitting very quickly. And that's really discouraging now because I injured my hands and I've had to significantly slow down yarn craft production. I know it doesn't seem like it because I've just kind of thrown that energy into everything else I could possibly do. But I had a lot of things on the needles when I hurt my hands. So having to slow down is really difficult when your brain is just like, if you're not doing this constantly, you're a worthless human being. So my brain is a very angry person. So yeah, watching somebody who regularly podcasts, I think it's been a while since her last one, but in these early podcasts, she's podcasting about weekly, it seems. And she's the first to admit that she's a pretty slow knitter, but it's encouraging that, I don't know, you can find joy in making things slowly, even if they're not going as fast as you want them to. That kind, I don't know if that makes sense, but I'm having a great time watching Nancy's podcast, which is the important thing. And then I haven't really been watching anything else. I've mostly just been catching up on podcasts and YouTube videos, but I did see a short film, a Star Wars fan film, Han Solo, A Smuggler's Tale. This is on Jamie Costa, Costa? C-O-S-T-A. I don't know how he pronounces it. His YouTube channel. He's the one playing Han in, and it's a prior to the Star Wars movies short. Did I say the title right? Han Solo, A Smuggler's Trade. I might have said Tale, because I'm pretty sure I have a book series called. Oh, goodness. Anyway, Han Solo, A Smuggler's Trade. It's about 13 minutes long, and I recognize Jamie Costa, or Costa, from Vine compilations. He did a lot of impressions on Vine when Vine was a big thing. Which were really funny, and he does a good Han Solo, and it's a really good fan film, and I hope the official Star Wars film is half as good as that short. I have reservations about the Han Solo film, just because I haven't been the biggest fan of the story choices that they've been making. I don't know. I don't want it to be dark and gritty. I want it to be fun and ridiculous, because Han Solo is fun and ridiculous. I don't know where people get the idea that he's, like, serious in any way. He's just accidentally stumbling through life. Yep. Anyway. And then stuff I'm listening to. I've been re-listening to audiobooks over the past couple weeks. I did finish the Shatterpoint audiobook. I didn't put it in my notes here. I think I talked about it last week, but I'm not sure. But I'd listened to a bunch of new audiobooks kind of in a row, and my brain needed to reset, so it was back to familiar things. So I re-listened to Mall Lockdown by Joe Schreiber, narrated by Jonathan Davis. And I just started re-listening to Star Wars Clone Wars Wild Space, which is an utter delight. I didn't really write that one down in the show notes because I'm like in the first or second chapter. But I've talked about it on this podcast before. It's the one where Bail Organa and Obi-Wan Kenobi go on a magical adventure on a Sith planet and just suffer. They just suffer. That's... Yep. Just Obi-Wan Kenobi angst. Constantly. And then stuff I'm reading, I haven't really made much headway on that stuff either. I still haven't finished Book 5 of The Last of the Jedi, A Tangled Web, and I've done a little bit of progress on Dreams from the Witch House, which is a short story compilation in the Lovecraft universe written by women. But I've mostly just been catching up on fan fiction. And not any one particular one, it's just been those fics that consistently update with their chapters, reading 1 or 2 chapters at a time, going through all those fics. I follow a lot of fic. I read a lot of fanfic. So it's mostly been that stuff. No new epic fics to tell you about. Been rereading a little bit of some of the old ones, just like finding my favorite bits and rereading them because I love doing that. It's really easy to do on fanfic because you just kind of have to know. Well, you have to know what the fic is called, or who wrote it, and then kind of find the general area where your favorite part is, and just reread that part. Which is really what I've been doing. It's been pretty chill the past couple weeks. So, that's it for this podcast. So I'm gonna sign off now. Show notes and everything are over at freakishlemon.com. You can join the Ravelry group. Just search Freakish Lemon in the groups tab and you will find us. Come join the blanket make-along, and when I get that thread up there, come talk about your half-square triangle quilt project, because I'd love to get as many people as possible playing around with quilts, because quilts are fun. And then you can follow me at all the fun places like Twitter, Tumblr, Instagram, and Ravelry as Freakish Lemon. And links to all these things will be in the down bar here on YouTube or somewhere around here if you're watching this somewhere else. And if you are here on YouTube and you want to follow along with what I'm doing, you liked this episode, you want to see more, consider hitting that subscribe button so that you get an update every single time I post a video. So yeah. That's gonna do it. Thanks for hanging out with me today. Goodbye.